On the morning of August 1st, 1966, shots ring out from the observation deck of the clock tower on the University of Texas campus. It marks the infamous beginning of the modern era of mass shootings in America.
I'm Sarah Ferris, true crime podcaster.
And I'm Catherine Schweit, the former head of the FBI's active shooter program.
And you're listening to Stop the Killing.
Hi, Sarah. Today I'm so excited that we were able to get my friend Dan Oates to the show because when I was, a baby trying to figure out how to deal with mass shootings, Dan had already dealt with, one of the worst in the country. And he's light years ahead of me, not in age, but light years ahead of me in experience. Hi, Dan.
Hey, nice to see you. Dan Oates, recently retired law enforcement, 40 years in the business, 18, almost 19 as a police chief. I grew up in the NYPD. I started in 1980. I left in 2001, a couple weeks before 9/11, to become police chief in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I was inspired by my time in the NYPD and working for some great police commissioners and decided I wanted to be a police chief and Ann Arbor would have me. So I went to Ann Arbor right before 9/11. I was there for 4.5 years. From there, I went to Aurora, Colorado, where I was the chief for 8.5 years. And 10 years ago, July 20th, 2012, we had the theater shooting. And ours at the time was the largest mass shooting in U.S. history with the most casualties, 70 people killed or wounded. Obviously, it's been eclipsed by a number of mass shootings since. So I did 8.5 years in Aurora, led the organization in the city through that crisis. And then I went to Miami Beach, where I was the chief for 5 years. And I thought I had ended my career in July of 19 when I retired. But I recently returned to Aurora May and did almost 8 months as the interim police chief back in Aurora. And so I retired again at the end of December 2022. And now I'm figuring out what to do next.
Maybe NYPD will call you and ask you to be the chief.
Yeah, that I wouldn't say no to, but that's not going to happen.
All of that experience in Ann Arbor in New York took you to Aurora. And then how long had you been in Aurora?
I was there 6.5 years when the theater shooting occurred. I was, well ensconced. In fact, I was probably even thinking about maybe I should be, exploring moving on. There's a shelf life to being an effective police chief, and it's probably around 5 or 6 years. So I was at that point when the theater shooting happened. Now, interestingly enough, I had the year before the shooting, based on what was going on in the world, I had said to my training staff, we really ought to do a full day of training on active shooting. And I'd like you to put something together. And the training staff did a great job. We had 126 people working the night of the theater shooting. And I ended up interviewing each one of those folks individually for about half an hour to an hour and talking about what they had been through. And every one of them said, that training we had done in the prior year was really, really important to my mindset when this thing went on, including the folks who went into the theater. We had about 30 victims who were so badly shot and injured that they couldn't get up and run out of the theater. And this whole notion of where you're going to have to step over the dead, you're going to have to step over the wounded and ignore them for a period of time until you're absolutely certain the threat has been eliminated. And everyone said that was a really important message from our training that I followed is, clear the theater first, then go back and help the wounded.
Could you just describe for our listeners, give them a thumbnail about what happened?
So again, it was an earlier time when these kinds of incidents were relatively rare. It's 12:38 in the morning. It was a Thursday night into Friday morning. It was the premiere of a new Batman movie starring, what's his name? Christian Bale. Geez, the name of the movie's blanking on me.
Was this Batman Returns?
Yeah, something like that. And at the time, the movie industry, literally, the premieres happened at midnight because the rules were the movie could only be shown on a Friday. So in order to create the aura around the movie, they would have midnight showings of a brand new premiere. And this film was showing, I think, 4 screens in a 16-screen theater in the center of Aurora, less than half a mile from police headquarters. And it was an event. Many of the people who showed up, were wearing costumes or whatever regalia because they were big fans of Batman. And where the shooting occurred was in Theater 9. Place was packed, about 350 in that theater. There was an adjoining screen, Theater 8, and some of those got wounded by rounds that penetrated the wall. The suspect was a socially maladjusted young man in his 20s, apparently highly educated, on a scholarship to go to the University of Colorado, a PhD program in neuroscience. And he had completed his first year and had decided to drop out. Our event occurs in July, beginning in March. He starts seeking psychiatric care from a psychiatrist team at the University of Colorado because of mental health issues he was dealing with. And beginning in May, he begins to buy weaponry, all legally, tons and tons of ammunition. When he goes into the theater, he is carrying a shotgun. He's carrying a AR-15, multiple magazines, including a 100-round drum magazine, and he's carrying a pistol, a Glock, 9mm. And he scoped out the place in advance. We have evidence of that. His operation was he came in civilian clothes. When the movie started, or the lights went down and they started, all the previews and stuff, he went out an exit door to the back of the theater, put a stopper in the door so he could get back in, suited up head to toe in body armor, including a gas mask, and brought inside 2 long guns, the shotgun and the AR, and the handgun. He threw a gas canister into the theater that not only was gas, but was pepper spray type irritant. And then he started shooting. And in the end, make a long story short, he fired 6 shotgun rounds, 65 AR rounds before his weapon jammed, and then 5 or 6 handgun rounds. Killed 12 people, wounded 58 people. Cops were there within 90 seconds. By the time they entered the theater, he was going out the back door. He was immediately apprehended. And then the story of Aurora becomes the rescue of those 30 terribly, terribly wounded people. The cops can't get paramedics to where the wounded are in the confusion of that event. And a decision is made by a young sergeant about 8 minutes in, put these folks in patrol cars and immediately transport them to the nearest hospitals. We had the advantage that there were 3 world-class hospitals, 1 within a mile, 2 within 3 miles. And cops very smartly divvied up where they were sending people and transported 27 critically wounded people by patrol car rather than by ambulance. And all 27 that the cops transported lived. Some of them with absolutely horrific injuries. One's a quadriplegic. Another woman lost a baby. She was pregnant and she's paralyzed from the waist down. There were several amputations, so almost certainly some of those 27, perhaps 10 or so, would have died but for those immediate decisions by those officers in transport. And 2 things have changed as a result of Aurora. One is that is an option for police now. And if you remember the Pulse shooting, which was, I think, maybe 16, I don't know what year.
Yep, 16.
You literally see videos of the cops putting folks in the back of pickup trucks and driving them to the hospital.
It really changed the attitude for law enforcement about how to respond. It wasn't so segmented that you show up at the scene, you're there in 2 minutes, you wait for 15 minutes for an ambulance to show up, you wait for 15 or 20 minutes for them to load somebody into an ambulance and take them to the hospital. And that was really the way the medical community wanted us to take care of people who were injured at a scene. But now I think that we recognize that law enforcement can work with fire and civilians can transport. At Pulse nightclub, there were civilians transporting all kinds of injured people to the hospitals. And that saves lives.
And police and paramedics, be they fire departments or whatever, trained together to anticipate this kind of event and how to get the paramedics urgently to, we'll call it the warm zone, the place where the wounded are, but we believe we could protect the paramedics and get them to them to begin treatment immediately. And there's a sense of urgency now within the professions to marry up the wounded with paramedics.
In retrospect, were there behaviors of concern that you recall about this shooter that maybe others had seen?
Well, I'll answer it this way. I left Aurora before the true case preparation for his trial. And by the way, Aurora was also rare, Sarah. Up at that point, most of these active shooters did not survive the incident.
Mm-hmm.
So our suspect was one of the first high-profile incidents where we had a live defendant to convict. So the evidence against him was overwhelming. And it was obvious his only defense was going to be that he was going to pursue an insanity defense, that he was not responsible for his actions. The way you overcome that defense in the United States is you have to prove that the defendant knew right from wrong and was aware of the consequences of his actions. So how do you prove that as investigators? And by the way, if you're an agency that goes through this, the number one thing you have to do after you care for the victims is you have to deliver a conviction. I mean, it's absolutely essential that you deliver some sort of justice for the families. And the one thing you control is the investigation. So there's going to be a capital murder case in Colorado. So the way we made the case against the suspect was by going back 6 months and a year, speaking to everyone that he had dealt with and looking at his entire digital profile, his online history, and those kinds of things. And we discovered that he had, in fact, talked about engaging in this kind of behavior and actually said things like, will you visit me in prison, to some of the folks that he was associated with.
To other people? He said those things to other people?
Yeah. And
Wow.
all of this became the evidence to defeat the insanity defense. Now, the other element to this story is that he had sought out psychiatric help. And at one point, he had actually told his psychiatrist with the University of Colorado that he was having fantasies about killing lots of people and that he was enjoying them. There was a point at which that psychiatrist mobilized, I don't know what they call it, the red team or something, of folks at the University of Colorado. She also reached out to the University of Colorado, the small police department on campus, and told an officer about this and asked the officer to look into the student's criminal history. This is before the event. This is about a month or so or 6 weeks before the event. And the professional convenes her psychiatric team. The student has told them that he is withdrawing from the program and leaving school and returning home to California, where he came from a stable home. So she has that information. The officer checks, and he has no criminal history and no history of violence, et cetera, et cetera. So for whatever reason, the university team decided that since he was returning home to California, there was no reason to do a mandatory mental health hold and have him checked into a mental health facility under Colorado law, against his will if necessary.
Hey, wait, Dan,
So-
so time out. Mandatory mental health hold. If they had done a mandatory mental health hold under federal law, he wouldn't have been able to buy any weapons if it had been reported.
Yes. But, then there's a whole other issue in the American healthcare system. What happens to someone when they're evaluated in one of these things? But at any rate, the police officer is told by the medical or psychiatrist, we don't think there's a basis for a mental health hold. So obviously, the police officer was contacted as an independent authority of state law to do a mental health hold as well. She decides, well, if the sheriff doesn't think it's necessary, there's no point in me doing it.
Are those all just missed signs that we wouldn't miss today? Do you think?
Well, would they miss today? Come on, Kate. Yes.
Come on, what? Wait, finish that sentence. What were you gonna say? I mean, what? Honestly, what?
It's the exact same scenario could occur again today. Listen, I finished up my career 5 years in Miami Beach, and there is a very, very robust homeless community in Miami Beach because tourists are very, very generous, homeless people in Miami Beach. And we probably did mental health holds I'm guessing we might have done 5 to 15 a week in Miami
Holy
Beach.
cow.
And we would take them for a psychiatric evaluation and they would be released immediately. So I don't have any great confidence that today would be any different.
So what would change that? What would change your beliefs in that we would do a better job? Is that action by the public and reporting, action by the police, action by the mental health, money, support financially to support departments and mental health agencies that are trying to deal with people like that?
I think it's more about the healthcare system. I think it's more about more event space, more doctors, more of an earnestness around evaluating folks when they're sent into the system. System doesn't have the infrastructure to support the volume. And of course, it's also all about the guns.
Dan, for the listeners, how did the verdict play out?
I'll tell you a little bit about the legal side of this. It's kind of complicated. The shooting occurs early on a Friday morning. We had I would describe it as a testy relationship with our district attorney. She was term limited. Shooting occurs in July. She's going to be replaced by a newly elected district attorney in January. Okay. And she clearly was and legitimately concerned about pretrial publicity. But we knew her well enough that we knew that she was going to run into court on Monday morning and get a gag order, which would have gagged prosecution and defense from making any public statements about the shooting. Now, when you're a police chief and you're dealing with something as absolutely horrific and traumatic to a community as this kind of event, you don't want to be gagged. There are a number of messages that you want to put out to the community, including that government is large, in charge, and is going to get us through this crisis, mobilizing community support for victims, explaining what has happened and reassuring the community that it's under control and that the danger is past. So we knew about midday on Friday that on Monday morning, we weren't going to be able to talk about any details of the case. Now, I will also tell you that as a police chief, you are a forever advocate for your police department, and my cops did a hell of a job. So we had until Monday morning to put out whatever we were going to put out by way of what occurred in our response, et cetera, et cetera. And also whatever messaging that we thought we needed to the community about the event on Monday morning. The gag order came down. Okay. And that had a real impact on my cops. They were never, ever able to tell the story of what they had done and what they had been through. And I think that had a real negative impact on them. They needed to be able to be interviewed. They needed to be able to speak to people. They needed to be able to tell the story because they were truly traumatized. I used to say, we're all victims. The entire community has been victimized. Every first responder is a victim. And it was very, very farce to not be able to tell the story. So our event occurs in July. The following April is the Boston Marathon. Those guys, there was no gag order in that case. And the brother who survived was convicted
Right.
before we went to trial. So our trial occurs 3 years after the incident. Our trial occurs in June or May and June of 15. Okay. And my cops, for the first time, are able to tell their story on the witness stand. So we go through the trial. The trial takes 6 or 8 weeks. Many of my cops broke down in tears on the witness stand. It was so traumatic to finally tell the story 3 years later. And what they had been through was so horrific. And of course, we have to disprove his defense beyond a reasonable doubt, which we successfully did. And he is convicted. And then we move to the sentencing phase. Now, interesting story about our suspect. The day of the shooting, he puts in the mail to his psychiatrist a 50-page manifesto. Okay. We arrest him, and Sunday night, there's a phone call made to the University of Colorado from his defense attorney saying, my client has mailed something to his doctor, and he wants the package back, if you can imagine.
That happens a lot. I'm sure. No way.
So the package arrives on Monday morning at the University of Colorado. And pursuant to instructions from the district attorney, we're very confident and eventually we're going to get to see it, but we expect motions from the defense. So we seal a thing up, okay? And we don't look at it. There's a year of litigation, and eventually there's a ruling that it is evidence and it's made available to us. When it was made available to us, I took a look at it, and clearly he was disturbed. And the writings are bizarre. And when I took a look at that, my one reaction was, and Sarah, I'm also an attorney. My one reaction was that it's going to be hard to convict him to death. It's going to be hard to convince the jury. He's clearly a disturbed mind.
Yeah.
And, we can prove that he knows right from wrong. We can prove that he knew the consequences of his actions. So we should be able to convict him. But I think a jury's going to be hung up on whether or not his mind is so troubled that he shouldn't be put to death. And that's exactly what happened. I believe there was at least one holdout juror who said, I just can't convict him. And without a unanimous verdict for death, he got life in prison without the possibility of parole. And that was his final verdict. But the pressure on us, law enforcement, to deliver a conviction, and I'm so proud that we did, us collectively, our team and the district attorney. I mean, you get to know these families, you get to know these victims, and it's the one thing that you really, really want to deliver is a conviction, because that's what's within our control to do.
It's so hard to actually imagine being stuck on what I guess is a slight life hold, isn't it? Before you get any closure to a case. Like 3 years is such a long time for everybody involved. But for your police team, what does that look like in between in terms of support and counseling? Is that readily available? And was it then?
We had top shelf. We were fortunate in that regard. There's a very well-known, very experienced police psychologist, and he had a team. His name is John Nicoletti, and he made his name, and his organization's name, CONmunity, which was 13 years earlier, and right down the street from Aurora. And he mobilized his team that night. And for the next month, all he did was help us, the larger workforce of the entire city. And he was there for us and, all throughout. There's a whole really sort of interesting, as a police leader, how do you deal with this? Anyway, there were a handful of cops who resisted, but we eventually got through to them and broke them down and got them to go. Did have one of the superhero cops of that night did leave the organization on a psychological disability. He's the one, there was one little girl who died in the theater shooting. She died in his arms.
Yeah.
He had been a first responder 13 years earlier, CONmunity,
Oh,
as,
my goodness.
as a young deputy sheriff.
Mm.
And I saw him at the 10-year reunion. He's doing extremely well. One of the ways our cops cope, Sarah, you can appreciate this, is every year at 12:38 in the morning, the officers line up the patrol cars. Families and folks stand outside the theater, and at 12:30 in the morning, there's a parade of police cars with lights and sirens that go by. And they've done that every year for 10 years.
It's amazing. It's
It's
actually bringing tears to my eyes. It just gives you a chill
very
right down the spine.
And I did that this year at the 10-year commemoration. And it's very, very powerful.
And were there things about the community that surprised you? I mean, did you and the department get, things sent to it like cookies and teddy bears
Yeah.
and
The entire community was so powerfully impacted. Everybody knew someone who was in that theater. Literally, for the rest of my time there, a day or a week wouldn't go by where I would be speaking to someone who would say, my niece, my nephew, my brother was in the theater. Now there were 1,200 people in the complex. Everyone was touched by it. And one of the things that happened is people just started sending us, the cops, and I'm sure the firefighters too, stuff, food, whatever, gift cards, just pouring in. People wanted to do something. And at some point, I don't know, the second day or something, someone said, we better keep track of who's giving us stuff. And a year later, we produced all these plaques. And there were two kinds of plaques. There were plaques that I created thanking police agencies for sending cops that night. And then plaques to, food vendors and restaurants. And I spent 2 days driving around the community, handing out these flags and taking pictures, at the 1 year anniversary saying, thank you for, supporting us the way you did. We had somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 cops come from all over the region that night. One of the most powerful transmissions that night is you hear our radio folks calling for help. And all the same agencies that responded to Columbine 13 years earlier, one by one, they tick off, we're coming. And when they came, we had some challenges. The geography of our event was we were at a theater, and right next to the theater was a 1 million square foot mall, okay, indoor mall, and some doors were open. Literally, you could walk into the mall. And we were told that there was at least two gunmen. So we had one in custody. And then to the east was a huge open field. So we got one in custody with a rifle. And we believe there's another one. And we have 1,100 witnesses. So there's plenty of work for the cops to do to clear that mall, clear all the areas around, and cajole as many of these witnesses as possible to get on buses and go to the nearby high school, which became the reunification and investigation center, and submit to interviews. And so we use those 200 cops to do that stuff. And Sarah, one of the most powerful things, I think your listeners appreciate this, is, you're a police chief and you're supposed to know what to do. And I'm doing a press conference in the parking lot, and now it's 4 a.m. and I'm done with the press. And I'm like, what do I do next? And the right thing to do is to go over to the high school and see how our folks were managing the investigation and talking to witnesses and check up on my cops. But I had this irrational thought that I had to find the officer or the child had died in his arms. And I have to find him. I have to talk to him. I have to give him a hug. Well, he was at the high school. So I didn't go to the high school out of sort of a great wisdom as a police leader. I went to the high school to find Mike. And I go to the high school, and one of the most powerful memories I have is 4:30 in the morning. Okay, by the way, we locked down the parking lot. So anyone who drove to the theater couldn't get their car because we didn't know what we had. And we didn't know if a car was connected to the event. So these people couldn't go anywhere. And my cops in the middle of the night find a ton of buses, and they bus people over to the high school. I mean, the cops are so resourceful. They opened up the high school. I don't know how they did that. So I get over to the high school, and there's literally 50 to 80 Aurora citizens waiting on one to be interviewed before they go home, to do their civic duty, to be interviewed about what they've seen. And then dispersed across the entire ground floor of the high school are little desks, little student desks with an investigator and a witness. And the investigator is either one of my detectives, an FBI agent, or an ATF agent. And these folks had figured out all on their own, without me telling them what to do, and their wonderful leadership, that we got to get statements from all these people, and let's just get it done. And there was an assembly line going on of investigators getting statements, and it was powerful. And, I'll never forget it. And then, of course, later on that day, the worst 90 minutes of my life was about 4 p.m. And we had 10 bodies in the theater because we still had a crime scene. And we had 10 families couldn't locate their loved ones. Okay. and all other wounded, et cetera, and 2 deceased at the hospitals. Those families had all been notified, connected, et cetera. And so we met in the library of the high school with those 10 families, about 120 people. And it was me, it was Jim Yacone, the SAC for the FBI, and the district attorney. And I opened up the meeting. I wasn't going to sugarcoat it by saying, almost certainly, okay, we have 10 bodies in the theater. You represent 10 families who cannot locate your loved ones. Almost certainly, your loved one is deceased in the theater. But we can't confirm that until we complete crime scene. The one thing we can do for you folks is convict this guy who did this. And in order to do that, we have to properly handle this crime scene. And I'm terribly sorry to tell you this. And I'll never forget, I remember one father saying to me, you mean to tell me my little girl is lying dead in the theater and you won't let me get to her? But on the whole, the families were understanding and respectful. But it was an awful 90 minutes.
Hey, Dan, how did you keep your composure? Like, did you cry during that? I would have cried. I'm a crier.
I'm crying
I-
now.
I don't think I cried during that, but it was awful. It was, it's life altering. One of the things, Sarah, is we as a community went through all of this. So this is July of 12. And as a community, this is a city of 400,000. I feel like we're finally climbing out of it. It's December. It's early December. And Newtown happens,
Yeah.
which, I mean, they're all awful, but there's something terribly, horrifically awful about Newtown.
Yeah.
And there was this sort of collective funk as a community that we went into because we so fresh for us, and we knew exactly what was happening in Connecticut, and there was nothing we could do to help that community. We actually tried to get through to authorities there and said, we'll send Nicoletti and his team. Nicoletti said he would go, and our police psychologist. We'll send Carol O'Shea, who was our victim advocate leader, and her team. We'll send these people to help. But we couldn't get through to a decision maker. And, I'm convinced that we should have a rapid mobilization of folks who have been through it. And we're working on that. We're trying to sell that to the law enforcement community. So far, we're not getting traction.
That's a door Dan and I have both been knocking on for a while. Dan is the leader, I think, but there's plenty of people on that bus.
Yeah. The value, for instance, of having someone who's led an investigation, a detective or a detective sergeant who's been the case lead on one of these, show up within 48 hours and just sit side by side for a week with the case lead on the new one. I mean, that would be invaluable because it's so hard to manage one of these cases.
Hey, Dan, did you find Mike in the high school?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
What was he doing? Was he working or was he just sitting there?
He was working. They were managing the crowd control and, directed people. And of course, the other thing that was happening at the high school was families were showing up. Everyone who ran from the theater dropped their cell phone. One of the things my cops tell me, they had to guard dead bodies in the theater. And 2 images that stick with me was the incessant ringing of cell phones, families trying to get to people that they couldn't reach. And then footwear. People literally, it was a hot summer day, and people literally took their sandals off, relaxed to watch the movie. And there was footwear all over the place in the theater. But yeah, so no, it was plenty of work to do. There's all kinds of complications you don't think of. You realize as soon as it's over and the crisis is over, now it's all about the victims and the families. Things like we got to get families here. We got to go pick them up at the airport. We got to help with air travel. You name it. One of the things we did, which was really, really smart, is we reached out to all the public information officers in the region from various law enforcement agencies. And we assigned a public information officer to each of the families of the deceased. And we told the media, do not call the families anymore. If you want information, families, you go through the PIO. We took a tremendous burden off the families. Families could choose to talk to the media or not talk. The PIOs would stage it, et cetera, et cetera. And it was a tremendous relief to the families not to have to deal with the media and their work. And the media respected that process. Those are things we did on the fly, and now they're sort of model national.
Dan, I hear a lot of times when I talk to people, a lot of deflective criticism when I talk about it's important to train for run, hide, fight, or it's important to train for stop the bleed. It's important for law enforcement to get their training in active shooters. I hear, why aren't you spending more money and time focused on prevention?
Well, we're back to the conversation we started with. What's the definition of prevention? How do you prevent our person or someone similarly situated from doing this again? Okay. Our mental health system doesn't support, I've described that every cop in America knows you take someone in on a mental health hold, almost all the time they're released in 2 to 4 hours. We had an incident, Sarah, you would appreciate this. I think this occurred after our shooting. We had an incident in Aurora where someone was clearly mentally deranged, a male. A family has their garage door open, which we will see in a little bit of neighborhoods, someone has their garage door open. And a guy goes completely naked, goes into the open garage door and starts trashing the garage of a family. Okay? Cops are called. Cops apprehend him.
Right.
He's obviously in the middle of some kind of psychotic crisis. But he's also committed a burglary and damaged property. So the cops have two choices. Arrest him for the burglary or treat him as a mentally deranged person, take him to the hospital for a psychological evaluation. The cops choose the latter, the compassionate choice, okay? The guy is released within, I don't know how many days or hours or whatever, but he's evaluated and released. He goes down to Pueblo County to the south and murders 2 people.
No. I did
So
not think
then,
that's where this story
where's
was
the
going,
blowback?
Dan.
Blowback comes to Aurora. Why didn't you arrest him? The burglary. He have committed the murder. Okay. So is it really a failure of the Aurora police? They made the compassionate choice between those two options. But until we solve this issue of mental health and the lack of support care for mental health, combined with the explosive or in the pun trigger of accessibility to weapons in America, I don't know what we do. So
We keep training our law enforcement. We keep training our civilians to do a better job when tragedy strikes.
Well, I know that we've taken up a lot of your time, Dan. I've got one more question that I'm going to sneak in. I want to ask you, I mean, you have had such a long career. What do you think you're the proudest of out of those years that you've served?
easily in my career, the thing I'm most proud of is how well my cops and my agency responded on July 20th, 2012, and in the many months in the aftermath, including getting conviction.
Thanks for listening. And if you want to know more, Catherine's book, Stop the Killing, is out now. For more details, go to catherineschweit.com. Please consider also supporting our independently made podcast. It's simple to do. Go to patreon.com/Stop the Killing. And for as little as the price of a latte a month, you can be part of the solution to stop the killing. Patreon rewards range from official do-gooder status to ad-free episodes, autographed books, and opportunities to connect with us directly for your business, school, church, or even just a book club chat. But just knowing that you are part of a movement that has the power to make your community safer, well, that's got to taste better than a skinny cappuccino any day. So please head to patreon.com/Stop the Killing now and polish off your do-gooder halo and make sure to include your name so we can give you a shout out. This podcast is a CONmunity podcast production. That's Con with an N. If you want more content, then head over to CONmunity Podcast at Instagram, where you'll find trailers on more binge-worthy true crime, like the award-winning podcast Conning the Con. And check out our show notes for all the links mentioned. Finally, if you want one takeaway action that you can do right now that can help make our community safer, please share, rate and review this podcast wherever you listen. Everybody needs to know that they hold the keys to see something and say something. Together, we can stop the killing.
It's one of those things you hope never happens, but you better train for it, because it will happen, and it will happen in places you wouldn't expect. Be ready for it.